Welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm really looking forward to the event we're going to have now on the role of fossil fuels in Africa's energy transition. As many of you who are watching this program will know already, this is a very live topic on which there are strongly held views on both sides of the question. And what I'm hoping and expecting we'll be able to do today is to try and understand a bit better what lies behind these strongly held and often diametrically opposed views, and to what extent can we find common ground that will help us to address the very real problems that African households, African firms face, not only in terms of reliable and affordable energy access, but also in terms of their contribution to ensuring the sustainability of the planet. I'm also very happy that we're doing this event in partnership with the OECD Development Center, and that Raga Arnadottir, the director of the OECD Development Center, is going to be moderating this event with a great group of panelists. So without any further ado, I'd just like to thank Raga, thank all the panelists, and thank all of you, and turn it over to Raga to take it from here. Over to you, Raga.
Thank you very much, Masood, and thank you and to all of your team here at the Center for Global Development for our great partnership. And I second what you said, that I look very much forward to the debate here today and the stellar lineup of speakers that we have here with us. And as you mentioned, we are here to take stock of a debate that is very topical. We just came from the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the topic is on the place of fossil fuels, especially gas, natural gas, in Africa's energy transition. And several African leaders have recalled how urgent it is to end energy poverty while transitioning to clean energy sources. It's a topic that has many views, and we hope to hear very many of them here today. And of course, the topic of, or the objective of this discussion is to move it forward and to find synergies and convergence, hopefully at the end of this event. Western countries owe much of their historic wealth to fossil fuels and continue to generate billions in annual revenue by exporting them. And the leaders of many African countries argue that they too should be allowed to build wealth by tapping and selling their own reserves. Africa accounts for less than 3% of the world's cumulative energy-related CO2 emissions, and has the lowest levels of energy access of any continent. Many African countries have therefore made the powerful argument that the pace and scale of the transition should depend on each country's resource endowment, capacity to take action, and historic contribution to the problem. The good news is that a broad range of technologies exist to support different low-carbon transition pathways, but countries need support to make sure that they are adapted to their natural context and development priorities. Now, following the war in Ukraine, European governments are looking to Africa, as well as to the Middle East, to replace Russian gas. The European Union's climate chief, Frans Timmermans, has argued that fossil fuel should play a transnational role in African countries' journey to become clean economies. The alternative perspective, however, is that investors that continue to finance fossil fuels in Africa are also displacing future investments in renewables and delaying Africa's energy transition. If we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, it will be harder for African countries to decarbonize. President William Ruto of Kenya, which has become a leader in renewable energy, recently called on Africa to break free from the chains of fossil fuel. And African climate activists have recalled that while dependence on fossil fuels has benefited well-connected elites, it has left the rest of the population in poverty without access to energy. They also argue that as cost of renewables continues to fall, fossil fuel development could drain public resources. And as Western countries accelerate their transition to renewables, new gas projects could become stranded assets. Not least, Africa is perhaps the planet's most exposed region to climate change and climate disruptions, which means that African countries have a strong interest in securing an effective low-carbon transition. So the issue is complicated, and I have briefly outlined the pros and cons of several of the topics that we're going to be discussing, but I am not going to solve the problem, but I'm hoping that my colleagues here on the panel will contribute to that and to enlighten us on these issues. We have an excellent panel of speakers. Again, thank you for joining us. I would like to introduce the panelists here quickly. Our first panelist is Professor Yuba Sokona. Welcome, Professor. He will talk about how energy transition policies need to differentiate between different African countries according to these countries' natural resource endowments and individual circumstances. Professor Sokona is a senior advisor on sustainable development, or the South Center, and a former vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's also honorary professor at the University College of London, a member of the Science Advisory Committee of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and a special advisor to the African Energy Leaders Group. With over 35 years of experience addressing energy, environment, and sustainable development in Africa. So he is a well-known authority in this field. On my left, here in the in-house, I have Dr. Raul Alfaro Pelico, hope I pronounced that right, who is the Senior Director of Rocky Mountain Institute's Energy Transition Academy within the Global South Program. Welcome. Raul leads RMI's capacity development efforts to secure a net zero future for all. Having held multiple roles at multilateral institutions and multinational enterprises, he advises national delegations to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as a member of the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support Network. He's a private sector observer for the Climate Investment Fund's Global Climate Action Program and a Just Transition Initiative. And he has a PhD in engineering from Lancaster University in the UK. Online, we also have with us Dr. Vijaya Ramachandran, and she has taken a strong position in favor of African countries exploiting their natural gas resources, among others in series of articles in Foreign Policy magazine. And she will present us with the arguments for this. And Dr. Ramachandran is Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute, and her research focuses on economic growth and energy infrastructure, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. She has 3 decades of experience in public policy and academia, serving on the faculty of Duke University and as well as my alma mater, Georgetown University, as well as working at the World Bank, the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Center for Global Development. And she's also on the board of Energy for Growth Hub. Welcome, Dr. Ramachandran. And last but not least, we have Aaron Sain. He has worked extensively on just energy transition partnerships and will tell us what role these partnerships can play in Africa's clean energy transition. Dr. Sain is a Senior Governance Officer at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, where he works on issues related to the energy transition. One particular focus for him is the challenges and opportunities fossil fuel-rich countries face as they shift to renewables. An anti-corruption lawyer by training, Aaron has conducted investor due diligence, market research, and complex financial crimes investigations, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And before we begin, a note to you, dear audience, after a couple of rounds of questions here with the panelists, we will be happy to take your questions. And if you're online, please enter them in the Zoom chat, and we will get to them during the Q&A session after the panel discussion. But moving to you, dear panelists, and I will start with you, Professor Sekona. You and others recently published an article in Natural Energy arguing that Africa needs context-relevant evidence to shape its energy future, clean energy future. In your article, you say that to achieve development and climate objectives in Africa, the international community needs to embrace and support nuance and country-specific analysis, not blanket calls to Africa to go green. Could you please tell us what this would mean in practice, Professor?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I just want to make some correction. I am not a former vice chair of IPCC. I am a current vice chair of IPCC, and I'm a former special advisor of South Center on Sustainable Development, just to make that correction. I think that the problem is the Africa energy issue has never been put on the table. What the future of Africa, what the present, the future of Africa energy is for development. That's the point. Africa needs development. Without energy, there is no way you can develop. And this is this is a starting point. But then the development of energy for development is not only related to access, and then you have to go beyond the access aspect, and then to be much more concrete. Do we want each of the African country and then to have a minimum of 1,500 kilowatt hour per year of electricity? This is access, this is concrete. And then if we take Brazil, is 2,500. Currently in Africa is less than 600 kilowatt hour per person. If we move from that to 1,500. And what will be the future of Africa energy system? It will be zero and low carbon, the future. But one have to start somewhere, because we have a diversity of countries. The countries are not the same. The starting point are not the same. I'm in Mali, in Bamako. The energy situation in Mali is completely different from the situation in South Africa. South Africa has built the energy system. The infrastructure is in place. It's heavily dependent on fossil fuel, and particularly on coal. And then while in Mali, and then the energy system is not yet in place, is embryonic. It can start completely different. It can start from the renewables. And then if we take, and then we cannot take those two situations and then to say that the starting point are not the same, even if in the future, all of them have to move toward a low to zero carbon future. And then we look at the continent, because there is a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. None of those discussions is based on evidence. And this is why we published that paper, and then to say that we need evidence-based analysis in order to better inform what kind of policy is needed. And then all the continent cannot take as the same. And then when we look at the continent globally, we can have 4 key situations. I define the 2 extremes, such as South Africa and some of the North African countries, and countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on. In between the 2, we have a country like Kenya, Ethiopia, that benefit from a renewable based electricity production. In the case of Ethiopia, it's hydroelectricity. In the case of Kenya, it's geothermal. And then they can easily, in terms of electricity, to decarbonize the electricity system. That is possible. They can do it faster because they have some basis for that. This is not the case of the other country. And then we have a fourth category of country, and those countries that are facing some kind of dilemma, what route to take. You have countries like Mozambique, countries like, DRC, country like Nigeria, country like Senegal, country like Mauritania, all of them have discovered natural gas. It's important that they use energy resources for development. It's important that, and then they will look at those resources as some kind of asset, and then to move to for development. And at the same time, they have to look at what is happening at the global level in the context of climate. Even if you're not looking at the climate context, what is happening if we look at in the future, maybe in the next 15 to 20 years. We are looking at particularly the transport sector. We are looking at what is emerging is electrification of the transport sector, and then the digitalization of the economy. And then we are also facing a conjunctural problem that is Ukraine, and then just not a structural problem, it's a conjunctural problem. And then at the same time, if the African want to invest, and then they have to use their natural gas, they want to invest in natural gas, and then they have to look at down the road within 20, 30 years, because that will require a huge amount of investment. A large part of investment will be related to export, not to use at local level, because those who are resources will not invest, and then for development of the continent, they will invest for export. And then in the 20 years to come, they may no longer need the gas, because they are moving to the electrification of the economy. And then those are some of the issues they need to have in mind. They may have a standard asset, and then that related to what kind of contract they will have with those who want them to invest. But fundamentally, crucially, is to look at the continent. And fundamentally, crucially, one have to look at the industrialization of the continent. At the current level of renewable, this industrialization cannot happen. And then we have to look at all those different elements, and then to have evidence based on all those different elements, all those different aspects, in order to better inform the policies. Let me stop from here. Sorry to be a bit long.
Thank you very much, Professor. And you, it was very good for us to listen to you sort of set the scene, and it's a good description of the complexity of the situation in Africa. We tend to talk about Africa as one continent, but as you explained, of course it's a one continent, but as you explained, the situation is different in the different countries. I want to turn now to you, Raúl, if I may. I'm from Iceland. We are always on first name basis. In a recent op-ed, you are entitled "The Time for Radical Implementation is Now." You argue that current efforts to develop new infrastructure for natural gas should be reconsidered. You say that more in-depth country-specific energy planning is required to determine what, if any, role natural gas should play in the global south. What did you take away from the discussion on natural gas at the recent COP27?
Thank you so much for having me and for the question. I just want to take this opportunity to thank the Center for Global Development for inviting RMI to this conversation, and also the OECD. And as you rightly said, we put out this article, which we called our COP27 manifesto, ahead of the conversation in Egypt, because we knew what was coming. And I think my biggest takeaway coming back from Egypt is that indeed the conversation needs a lot of evidence. And so I'm not going to repeat everything that we just heard from Professor, because that's exactly what's happening. And so, there's a lot of, as you introduced earlier as well, correctly, there's a very heated debate. Mm-hmm. And it's one where you obviously have diversity of views. But oftentimes in fora such as COP, and maybe in other fora, the conversation is very much made, in the context of trade-offs. And oftentimes, you are only looking at the two, extremes of the spectrum. there's a significant middle ground, and that's the same middle ground that Professor just clearly outlined. When you think about Africa, you're talking about more than 50 countries, each of their own with their own national circumstances. The other thing that I've noticed also in the conversations at COP, and that speaks to these growing agenda on energy transition plans, as well as just energy transition partnerships, is this focus on the justice part of it and the equitable part of that. And I think Professor alluded to it, particularly if I think about Mozambique as one of the countries that in Africa are investing in gas. Essentially, Mozambique is basically investing $20 billion in gas infrastructure offshore. But then the country has 75% of its population without access to electricity. And so one thing that is clearly emerging from the conversation that we anticipated is that if we, instead of focusing on just the energy side of it, or even the environmental aspects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, or and even if we leave behind the economic implications, because of course, every country has its right to development and is looking at, economic growth. But if we just talk about people only, and we go back to this statistic of 70% of the population in Mozambique lacking access to electricity, that's when you realize that, we can talk about investment all we want, we can talk about the technologies that are coming on a stream, even on the clean side, but if it doesn't really serve the purpose of people, I think that's where we have a significant failure. There's obviously have been lots of conversations about loss and damage, also about adaptation, and in general about the finance, because I think it's also an important consideration, in the context of Africa. Africa has 39% of all, global renewable energy resources, yet it only has access to 2% of global investment. And so there is no way we can even address the challenge that Africa has without even bringing about the investment part. But let me just end on a point that perhaps I can elaborate a little bit further, which is how RMI is thinking through how to approach this debate. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not about trade-offs. And in fact, oftentimes, particularly when we compare the benefits, or the costs of clean energy versus fossil fuels, we think of indicators that are relevant, such as the levelized cost of electricity, that can give you some indication. And indeed, not only we have reached peak oil, and therefore African countries need to consider and reconsider whether you want to invest in and lock in investment, presumably for the long term, but precisely in the medium to short term, potentially will be ending up in stranded assets. I mean, the IIA has mentioned that there is a risk that up to $1.3 trillion worth of that investment, will be stranded assets by 2050. Now, leaving that aside, there's a lot of benefits that go beyond, the cheaper cost of a clean energy. One of them is job creation. It's been proven clearly that clean energy, such as energy efficiency and renewable energy, has a stronger and bigger job creation potential. Every $1 million of spending in fossil fuels can perhaps lead to maybe 2 or 3 jobs maximum, whereas investment in energy efficiency, almost 8 jobs, and clean energy or renewable energy, more than 7 jobs. So there's a significant job creation potential there. Talking about the just transition, there is a just transition potential. The way I think people should talk about just transition, very specific on, okay, who is that transition for? And so if we think about the role of women and the youth in Africa, Africa being the continent that will have half of the youth population in the world in just a few years, and also with women representing almost a third of the workforce in clean energy, clearly that's not anywhere close to parity. It's not close to 50%, but it's certainly above the 20% participation of women in fossil fuels. So there is a significant potential for women to be not victims of climate change, which is the case right now. As you mentioned earlier, Africa is the region that is the most vulnerable to climate change. has happened that 80% of climate refugees are women and girls. But here there's an opportunity to look at women and girls not as victims of climate change, but rather as the victors by joining the workforce. One last point that I will make on that is the third benefit that we see, and is a little bit away from just the focus on energy and even the focus on employment. It's about entrepreneurship. Renewable energy, particularly distributed energy resources, are locally based. And that means that you need to use the local labor force. You also need to look at local technologies. And therefore, it has like a significantly more local content potential. I have worked in the oil and gas sector for full transparency, and there has been a lot of discussion about local content. Local content is what you get from clean energy. So let me stop here. I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you very much, and for bringing in the perspective or the view of the opportunities that are in the green transition, but you also mentioned the just green transition, and you used the word justice, which leads me to our next panelist, Dr. Vijaya Ramachandran. You have published an article or a couple of articles in Foreign Policy, one entitled "Rich Countries' Climate Policies Are Colonialism in Green." Speaking of justice, can you tell us what you mean by this statement and how you came about that conclusion?
Thank you, Raga. Thanks so much for having me on this panel. My sense is that the rich countries are basically following the mantra of fossil fuels for me, but not for thee. So what we've seen in the last several years is, the United States and many European countries doubling down on oil, coal, and gas, while saying that Africans can only have financing for wind and solar projects. And a couple of examples, Norway has increased vastly its exports of gas to supply gas to Europe by increasing by 2 billion cubic meters a year. This week, Germany signed a long-term LNG agreement with Qatar to supply 15 million tons of LNG. The minister saying it would have been better if the agreement was 20 years rather than 15 years. The US is exploring lots of gas and oil and coal, while these same countries are at the World Bank and other places saying that Africans can only have wind and solar projects financed through multilateral channels. So why do I think this is deeply unjust? Why do I think it's a form of sort of green colonialism? I think our previous speakers have made the case for why sub-Saharan Africa has such a great energy deficit. There's enormous levels of energy poverty. There are 600 million people without access to a reliable and cheap source of energy. And also it has massive natural gas reserves. And the idea that it cannot use even a small part of that, to me, is deeply unjust. While rich countries are loading up on all forms of energy in the name of energy security, it seems like the fight for climate change seems to fall to African countries. They're the ones who have to curb emissions and combat climate change, while the rest of us, are busy increasing our levels of energy security. I think that, to me, strikes me as deeply unjust. I want to make 2 points about natural gas financing and why that's needed. I think there are several things that you cannot currently do with natural gas alone. You cannot build roads, with wind and solar alone. You cannot build roads. You cannot make fertilizer, which African countries desperately need to increase yields. And you cannot invest in cement and steel, which again, they need to industrialize. These are countries that are in large part yet to industrialize. And so I think there are several activities for which at least some level of fossil fuels is going to be necessary. And in particular, it will be necessary for African countries to exploit their natural gas reserves if they want to industrialize, if they do not want to stay poor. And every African government I know has said that they want to develop and want to become less poor and want to industrialize and become sort of part of the modern economy. So I think that point, that there are many things you cannot do with wind and solar alone, no matter how cheap those resources are, is worth making and worth remembering, at least for the near to medium term. I think the other point that is relevant to this conversation is that wind and solar alone are not viable simply because they are intermittent by nature. So we absolutely need a fossil fuel backup if we want to invest more in renewables. And I think from that perspective, gas is actually complementary to renewables. It's not a zero-sum game, and I wish we would stop thinking about it in that manner. You know, gas as a fossil fuel backup for variable renewable energy sources can play a really critical role in putting more renewables into the energy system. And many rich countries know this already. And so I find the conversation about not financing gas deeply hypocritical from that perspective. You know, until we have sort of cheap battery storage or battery storage at scale, we will need to have some sort of fossil fuel backup in the system. And so I think from that perspective, I see gas as kind of a very important transitional fuel, a fuel that burns twice as clean as coal, you know, a fuel that can help to sort of alleviate energy transitions, energy poverty, as well as enable a transition ultimately to renewables. It's going to be a long and complicated road. And I think cutting off energy sources for Africans at this point in time, while Europe and the US use whatever they like to increase their energy security, strikes me as a very unjust way to go about things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are sort of, the West is telling Africa, you should develop, but do it while being green. We didn't have to do that, but you have to do that. So that's kind of the summation of your point. To close off this round, I'm going to turn to you, Aaron. You argue in a recent paper that just energy transition partnerships could help lower-income gas-producing countries diversify their economies and energy systems away from fossil fuels, as well as boost energy access and compensate people hit by climate change. Can you tell us what just energy transition partnerships are, and how can these be useful in this debate that we're having here?
Sure. So just energy transition partnerships, or JETPs, to the extent that anyone knows what they are now, because they're so new and there's not that much detail and there's almost no implementation. But what they are is high-level political agreements between a group of wealthy, polluting, mostly global north countries and at least somewhat less wealthy fossil fuel producer. What the fossil fuel producer gets is a mix of finance and technical assistance for its own transition, shift away from producing and burning fossil fuels. And what the wealthier countries get is a fresh destination for their investor capital and a chance to say, look at us, we're making progress on our climate commitments. So 2 of these have been announced so far, one in South Africa and one in Indonesia. But again, it's very early days. I think these partnerships could be helpful in any number of ways. They could be a venue to find some pragmatic common ground on some of these really contentious issues, like international finance for gas, or the question of which countries should wind down their own fossil fuel production quickest, right, and first. They could also be a moment for the gas-producing country, the country with the gas reserves, the lower-income country, to look critically at the risks and the rewards of investing more in gas. In a number of the gas-producing countries where my organization, NRGI, works, we see governments saying, you know, we have these reserves of gas, why shouldn't we be able to use them for energy? Which, absolutely fair enough. And, you know, as some of the prior panelists have said, some of these countries may need some amount of gas to get what they want out of the transition, renewables and gas is not always some either-or proposition. And as the last speaker said, gas can provide things that renewables can't. And, it was a good list to which, you could also add heat for minerals processing, feedstock for plastics and petrochemicals, all sorts of other things that are part of the gas value chain, but not the renewables one. At the same time, investing in gas when the world is moving away from it can bring risks and can leave a country ultimately, potentially, with an energy system that is costlier, that is dirtier, that is more vulnerable to fluctuations in world commodity prices, that's unsustainable, and that doesn't necessarily meet the citizens' and the country's own economic needs. So, not to repeat what the prior panelists say, but we really do need some more of that evidence-based analysis on a country-by-country level that was discussed. I think the other thing that, on the justice angle that these partnerships can do is they can be an opportunity for countries to ask, as was said by Raul, who is this transition really for, right? Like, who is going to benefit? Because right now, the debate around energy transition in a lot of gas-producing African countries is at pretty early stages. People are unfamiliar with a lot of the concepts and the issues. They're still getting up to speed, and just the technologies. And because of that, like, the conversation and the political debate is very easily captured by vested interests and injected full of all sorts of misinformation and oversimplified claims and narratives. And that in turn fuels suspicion, right? And justifiable suspicion. What's going on here? Why are we being told we have to do these things? Who's really behind all this? Who's going to get rich? Energy for whom? And if consultation and communication and policy making around some of the investments in these partnerships is transparent and inclusive, that could be a way to address some of those concerns. But we'll see. Like I say, it's early days. These partnerships could be vehicles to help countries imagine what sort of energy system and economy they want for the future, or they could be vehicles for investors coming to build stuff that they want to build right now, which is mostly solar and wind farms. And that could be good, but it could be less than it could be. We'll see.
Evidence-based research, that's music to our ears at the OECD. But you also talk about the need for transparency and to find a pragmatic common ground. And that is, we've heard now from our four speakers the different sides of this argument or this issue. And as I said in the beginning, it's not easy, but the pragmatic common ground is what we are striving at, and where we avoid the mistakes that have been and build upon it. I'm going to turn now again to Professor Sokona. You argued in a recent article in The Conversation that Africa could be world leading in renewable energy generation if provided with the right technology and financial assistance. You say also that what Africa urgently needs is a credible plan for oil-dependent economies to avoid the need to transition to gas in the long run. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and tell us what that plan could look like?
I think that in Africa, we need to consider energy as a critical, means for achieving development as it has been done elsewhere, because it's not being addressed clearly. And then also to avoid every kind of jargons such as energy transition. if there is only one transition that needs to happen as soon as possible, this is to phase out completely the use of charcoal and firewood for cooking. Let us go back to Nairobi conference in 1981. We all thought that, within a couple of years, we get rid of that. But actually, in the transition discussion, no one is talking about it. It looks like something that's hopeless. In that regard, the African country has to look at the whole value chain of renewables, solar and wind, and hydro and biomass as well, because it is not only from the panel and the batteries, it's beyond that to strategic minerals, and then to look at all the value chain and to invest on knowledge, on science and technology. And this is the only way we can deal with that. And then to look at also at the value aspect related to the end-use technologies adapted to local condition of the continent. Because it's easy actually, and then to start, cooking with electricity generated by solar actually is possible, and then to use induction stoves. But one need to design those stoves adapted to the local condition, the African context, the cultural, the social, and the economic context. All those are possible. It is not importing from China, it's not importing from India, it's not importing from Europe. And then to look at and then to put energy at the heart of the development narrative. And then to put development at the heart of the climate narrative. And then if we bring those different elements and then invest on knowledge, invest on technology, and then this is possible, is doable. Because all the energy issues, all the energy perspective is addressed at the margin of what the other wants. It is not a crucial, a fundamental element. And then we are not looking also energy, a geopolitical nature of energy in the continent. We do not see those different elements. And then we have seen with the Ukraine war, and then those are fundamental. And the whole discussion, debate between renewable and natural gas, it's a completely, non-debate. And then one have to go to the fundamentals, how you have a better living condition of the African people, the better well-being of the African people. There's no way you can achieve that without energy. This have not happened anywhere in this world without energy. And then we have seen on the climate issues, the temperature is increasing in the continent because they're on low latitude. And then that means air conditioning in the African continent will become a necessity. It is not a luxury. And then all those different elements one have to put that in a perspective, and then to have a proper narrative of the continent on energy, climate, and development. Let me stop from here.
You bring up a very important point with the cooking of wood burning cooking, and that is not only polluting, but it's a health hazard, and people, and you mentioned women before, especially women are dying from that. So this is something that is a problem that needs to be solved. And thank you for bringing that up. And also the point that this is about the well-being of the African people. And that should be the guiding light in all of this discussion. Also regarding climate, I'm going to turn to Vyaja. You talk about in another article in Foreign Policy about the climate panic, quote unquote. Why the climate panic about Africa is wrong. Could you elaborate on that and tell us what you base this statement on? Are we just panicking about the climate issue in Africa?
I mean, there's been this narrative, right, that Africa is sort of this carbon bomb waiting to explode, which I just find, deeply wrong, and also just completely sort of counter to any kind of rational discussion around energy poverty and development and the need for Africa to industrialize. It has similarities to the conversation in the 1970s around India being a population bomb. this Malthusian specter. All these Indians are going to sort of ruin our nice lives because there's just going to be too many people on the planet. Now it's become, all these Africans are going to become huge emitters and again ruin, our lives on the planet and destroy all the gains that we have made. I mean, this could not be farther from the truth. Africa is not a carbon bomb. It is not going to have any foreseeable impact in any substantial way on emissions. As you mentioned earlier, Raga, at the beginning of this event, it's about 3 to 4% of emissions, global emissions. Cumulatively, it's 0.55% of emissions. Most African countries are pursuing renewables to a far greater extent than any rich country ever did. The fact of the matter is that rich countries remain very significant emitters and will be for a very long time. There will be some middle-income countries joining that pool, but it's not going to be countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot being made about the East Africa pipeline. At 200,000 barrels a day, that's 0.01% of emissions. But there is a sense in the media, particularly the Western media, that somehow all this energy use in Africa is going to be this enormous sort of burden to climate emissions. Simply not the case. The numbers do not bear that out. And I think most African countries will pursue very different energy paths than did Europe or the US or even East Asia. There are many more technological options now. Many countries are investing in hydro, geothermal, wind, solar. And so you're going to see a much better path. And I think having a very rational policy to enable Africans to build out their energy infrastructure, to alleviate energy poverty, will include some investments in fossil fuels. And that will be, as I said earlier, to provide backups, to provide things that we cannot do with wind and solar alone. And that will be part of a much bigger package of energy investments that will involve a lot of renewables. I think this kind of panicked conversation about Africa really is something we need to counter every time we see it. There's also numerous articles about gargantuan coal build-outs, usually based on South Africa's coal reserves and South Africa's coal activity. But the fact is South Africa is trying to phase out from coal. Our speaker earlier mentioned the Just Transition Partnership. That is not, South Africa's past is not Africa's future. Africa's investing a lot in renewables. And again, I think it's a question of kind of getting this narrative right so that we don't end up being racist in our attitudes about Africa's development, and that we don't sort of engage in energy redlining, where we're telling Africans, if you want to do it, we won't finance it. Those are not sort of constructive ways to go about this conversation. And I think having a very kind of clear, evidence-based picture on what Africa's emissions are like, they are very low. Even if they invest in some natural gas, they will continue to be very low for the foreseeable future. And I think sort of trying to shape the narrative as Africa being a carbon bomb is, again, kind of very deeply unjust and immoral. And it really does a disservice to governments that are trying to alleviate energy poverty and poverty overall.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Africa, the carbon bomb. Sounds like a thriller movie. Raul, you've argued that the countries in the global south should take the lead to have a homegrown approach to mobilize climate finance and scale the clean, resilient projects that the global south needs. But many African countries, as we have been discussing here, are discussing and arguing primarily for the right to exploit natural gas. Shouldn't each African nation be allowed to choose its own path to economic development, including through the exploitation of natural gas? I was in Senegal last week, and I know that they are starting their gas exploitation and have included it in their budget for the revenues next year. So isn't it the country's right to choose?
Thank you for the question, and also it's been amazing to listen to the different perspectives, and I think it's important to have them all on the table. So again, kudos to the Center for Global Development and OECD for this conversation. Just following up on your last point, Nigeria, the vice president of Nigeria a few months back was sitting down here and explaining its energy transition plan, and gas was part of that, right? But again, it's not just about gas, right? And he emphatically, talked about, the plans that the country has in investment in renewable energy. And I think if we just focus on the gas part of the conversation, then we're missing the bigger picture that, in fact, what Nigeria wants to do is transition out of, fossil fuels, irrespective of whether they can be part of the solution. Every country has its right to develop its own resources, and also every country should, have the evidence in doing so, rather than follow and fall into, these narratives of panic, which, when I hear about panic, and I actually like horror movies because they make me laugh actually. So let me say that out. let me just say that. But again, thinking about the people, which is what is front and center for me every time, I'm just thinking about, again, youth and the women. And I'm just thinking about, my own kids, my son and I had a long conversation about narratives like, the boy that harnessed the wind, right? And my daughter and I talk about, Solar Sisters, which is an organization that is empowering women in Nigeria as well as Kenya and elsewhere. And I'm just thinking about, look, none of them are talking about gas, right? And in fact, they're talking about human stories of, economic development. But let me address a few things that have been mentioned here in order to sort of like clarify a few misconceptions. Because, again, front and center for me is people and the social aspect, but let's just talk about the environment part. And, every time I hear natural gas, I always say there's nothing clean or natural about gas. So that's why I just talk about gas. And while gas can be cleaner than, fossil fuels such as oil, still, leads to methane leaks. And those methane leaks have 86 times the global warming potential more than carbon dioxide. So again, I think we need to bring all the facts on the table and, not talk about gas as if it's clean when, it still has significant environmental challenges, irrespective of the fact that it may be, less, emitting in terms of emissions compared to oil. So I think that's an important fact. Also from an environmental perspective, but as you mentioned, and as it was mentioned before, on the health side, when you think about those women in rural Nigeria or Ethiopia, and we talk about clean cooking, as it was mentioned just now, I mean, more than 2 billion people in the world that do not have access to clean sources of cooking, the majority of those people are in Africa. And the majority of these people are women, okay? And so, yes, that is associated to, burning of wood, but there is always this debate about, and therefore, gas is the solution to that. And again, I just mentioned the global warming potential of gas. And then this other point around, what's the word? The intermittency of, solar and wind. You can use batteries, right? And gas doesn't have to be the storage method for that. It can be even hydropower in the context of Ethiopia, or geothermal in the context of Kenya or Iceland, as you just mentioned. Why does it have to be gas? And I'm saying that because in the end, it looks like it's a trade-off between wood and gas when none of the two actually provide health outcomes for women in rural Africa and around the world. And so this is where mini-grids become very important initiatives. And there is one that we are working with the UN as well as with the African Development Bank, which is the Africa Mini-Grids Program, precisely to address that challenge. Now, if we move from environment into economics, look, the numbers are there, right? And the cost of electricity that is coming from cleaner sources is just coming down, right? And here is, as it was mentioned earlier, it's a question of how much risk you want to take for energy source and the infrastructure that you need to build around that, presumably for the long term, when financial markets will tell you that, in a few decades, they will have no value, right? I'm not saying that nobody will be using oil and gas. I'm just saying that the price of it, will come down. And so, you'll have many countries across Africa sitting with infrastructure that has no value. We didn't move out of the, the Stone Age because we ran out of stones, right? And, back in my days, I used to go to a video club, right? They do not exist. People talk about Netflix. Nobody asked for permission nor transition from video clubs to Netflix. And so those things happen as we blink. And so if, as an African decision maker, I'm just ignoring that, I'm just actually sitting with that bomb. So I'm not trying to be horror or panic, but I'm just being factual about the fact that this is also part of the right for economic development, which is choosing what is the path that is appropriate, but also being aware of the international dynamics. Precisely when you think about distributed energy resources, you do have the opportunity to actually own and shield yourself from those global dynamics. And so this is something important to bring to the table, because otherwise then we just, again, going to the extremes of the debate. Let me end on my favorite topic, which is always people, right? And I just love these, stories about the number of people that we have in the world, and Malthus comes to mind and others. And I agree that there's a scare, right, always associated to population growth and all that. Now, let me just tell you one important fact that actually affects every single country in the world, right, which is based on research from the International Energy Agency, some of which I don't fully agree, because first of all, it covers OECD countries only, and obviously the world is much bigger than that. And that population is primarily outside of OECD countries. But I think what is important to understand also, if I was an American or European, is that in order to reach net zero by 2050, the IEA produced its first World Energy Employment Report. We need to create 30 million jobs in the next 7 years that we have left. And so those are 30 million jobs made out of like 40 new jobs that do not exist today. Going back to Netflix and going back to technologies that we don't know that exist today, those are the new jobs that we haven't really created yet. They're not like on the job market, because these are jobs that will come from the new technologies. On top of that, there is, that 30 million figure is made of 60 million jobs that need to be transitioned, need to be repurposed, because they will become stranded. And so think about the last IRENA annual review on renewable energy jobs in collaboration with ILO, who we are partnering with. The figure today is that we have 12 million clean energy employees, and we need to get to 30 million. And those 12 million, it took almost 10 years to increase that figure from 7 to 12 million. And so I'm just saying we have less than 7 years left to get to 30 million. How are we gonna do that? And nobody's talking about that. And this is the reason why at RMI, and in my role as Senior Director of the Energy Transition Academy, I'm just focusing on people and bringing as many people with the skill sets, building the capacity of institutions, developing the workforce, and empowering the leaders to really focus on, upskilling, reskilling, training before it's too late. Because if not, if we don't have enough people to transition, we can have all the technology in the world. Even if we had all, we do have all the capital in the world, but if you don't have the people to actually, invest in clean energy, then you're definitely going to be in a very difficult space. So I just like to highlight that, while as many people as we have in the world, we don't have enough people to actually, to transition. This is where, going back to your question, we are engaging every single African leader. The Africa Mini Grids program involves 21 countries in Africa that represent 400 million people without access to electricity. We're just asking to one person in each of these 21 countries, what is it going to be? How are you going to make that decision? Do you need empowerment around that? Because it's not a black and white decision. It's not an either or. It's actually a bit more complex, but at the same time, there's lots of opportunities. So I wonder if that's something that other people are thinking about.
Exactly. And you bring up many of my favorite topics. You spoke about innovation before in your first intervention, and going back to the stones and the Stone Age, it wasn't the candle maker who invented the light bulb. We would still be sitting with very cozy candlelight if we would have waited for that. but at the same time, there is this dire need to get there. So that's the balance, the practical middle ground that you, Aaron, spoke about earlier. And I can tell you examples of exactly about the job prospects. From my home country, Iceland, there was a policy decision taken in the middle of the oil crisis in 1970 to switch from imported oil to heat our houses and to harness the geothermal resource that was under everyone's ground and had been partly utilized. But there was a policy decision based out of necessity because we couldn't afford the oil. And to mitigate both the risk and the cost, it was a policy decision made by very foresighted policymakers at the time that set up a loan fund, a government loan fund, where companies could apply for a loan to explore, because what is the hindrance to development of that sort of a resource is risk and cost. So they applied for a loan, they drilled. If the drilling was successful, the loan was paid up. If the drilling didn't succeed, the loan defaulted on the state. And 10 years later, 90% of Iceland was on geothermal, and now it's 100% renewable. And there are a lot of jobs that we didn't foresee that have been created. So that's an example, but it needs policy and it needs to be financed. And Iceland had the funds to be able to do that, and that is what maybe is lacking in that context. But Aaron, speaking of all of this, you said that developing countries, international partners, should not condition funding on for just energy transition partnerships on the promises of leaving gas reserves unexploited or to end the domestic gas use. Instead, these partners should work with the producing country to design and fund a faster, more ambitious transition away from gas and other fossil fuels. So this could be the solution to the problem that we're raising. But given the very large potential revenues from commercializing natural gas, is it realistic that these countries will that have this resource, as we were talking about, for example, with Senegal, will shift to renewables if financing for natural or gas production is available to them?
Well, I think that last part is kind of the million or the billion-dollar question. Is it available
You
to
have
them?
answer to it?
Well, here's the thing, is that this is part of this debate that really kind of drives me crazy, that people speak as if, some either friend or foe could come along and turn a key, and billions and billions of dollars in investment in gas projects would flow into Africa. And I don't know about that. Mm-hmm. If you look at the history, most gas exploitation in Africa, gas extraction, the funding for it was actually funding for oil exports that had some gas attached to them. Financing the extraction of gas all by itself is harder, and there's much less interest from commercial or other investors in that. And at this point in time, if an African country wanted to have a new gas export project, say, that would earn all those nice revenues, one, and probably more than one, private company in Europe or Asia would have to come and say, we want to buy that gas for somewhere between 10 and 20 years. And companies are not lining up to do that. They might buy it from Qatar, as was said, or they might buy it from here. But Africa, yeah, we'll see. And, these are mostly private companies that are signing these purchase agreements. And so even well-meaning rich governments can't force their private companies to buy gas from Africa when they could go buy it someplace else. So, so that's for the export projects. The situation with the domestic gas projects in Africa, things like power plants, is even tougher because there, most of the capital for the plants or whatever the project is has to come from private investors. But they won't get involved unless if international public investors like development banks or export credit agencies or whatever go first and absorb a bunch of the risk. And even before the US and Europe and a bunch of others made that statement at COP26 saying where there should not be international public finance for developing country fossil fuel projects anymore, the amounts of finance that were going to lower income country gas projects were tiny. I think recently it was about $3 or $4 billion a year, and almost all of that was going to Mozambique. Mm-hmm. The reality is this, right? That investors shy away from African gas projects because they're not sure they can make money off of them, right? It's not just about climate.
Not political.
I mean, I'm not saying that nobody cares about climate. I don't want to be cynical or unfair or anything like that. But the thing is, I guarantee you that if more investors thought that they could make steady income streams and decent rates of return off of African gas projects, the capital flows and the political talking points from countries like mine or in Europe would sound very different. And there wouldn't be this debate. So sometimes when I hear, African leaders or I hear African civil society voices saying, look, you should be financing these projects. Climate change is not our fault. I want to say, don't be fooled, right? Like that's not ultimately what this is about. It's very easy to hold up your hand and say, we solemnly swear not to fund any more fossil fuel projects in developing countries when you don't want to do it anyway. You lose nothing by that, right? There's nothing whatsoever. And what needs to happen going forward is that the wealthier countries need to be much more transparent and upfront about how much gas they actually intend to buy from African countries and whether they're actually going to fund any gas projects, export or domestic, in these countries. They need to get that on the table. And then the African countries, the gas producers for their part, need to look at the projects they want to do and see which of them actually make sense as investments. Otherwise, as long as this gas issue continues to take up all of the air in the room, what we'll have is stagnation and missed opportunities. There are bigger things to talk about. This issue needs to be settled, and then we move on.
One thing, just to follow up on this, and then we will open up for questions from the audience, and I hope that there's lively discussion, and our colleagues here will pose those questions. Ukraine, on the one hand, Europe says no gas production in Africa, and then the next day the German chancellor is knocking on the door because they need gas. The unprofitability in that, or the contradiction in terms. What's your take on that?
That it's gross.
That was simple.
that it is gross and self-serving, and shows very firmly that, like, look, you cannot rely on countries like ours for moral leadership on this issue, and you cannot rely on them for clear statements about what their intentions are, even though that's exactly what they should be doing. No, I mean, it's gross. Using these countries as a bargaining chip in negotiations that are really going on someplace else, in the US, in Qatar, or whatever, or making some sort of statement to Russia that, look, we can go buy things someplace else if we actually want to, is very unfortunate, and it creates all of these unrealistic expectations in the countries and wastes time and political capital and all sorts of other things. It's too bad.
Thank you very much. That was clear. Questions from the audience? Okay. I am told that we are, in the interest of time, that we will have no time for those questions. But I would like, before we go on to the sort of wrap up, offer each one of you like a 1 minute takeaway to react to maybe something that has been said, if you like. Professor, do you have anything, a last minute comment?
I think that the present and the future of energy in Africa is open to explore the various options, the various perspectives in a much more sustainable way and climate friendly. But it has to start with the African Development Agenda being at the heart of that. And then to mobilize all the resources for that. And then to define, because we have actually the possibility to have a wide range of different options, different energy systems. And then the classical energy system is no longer valid. And then all the effort should be directed to the continent, and then the industrialization of the continent is fundamentally crucial. And then those are some of the issues just one. And then to reiterate the fact that, and then we have to go beyond, some, expression of evidence-based analysis, and those are critical to inform policies at different levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for participating. And I'm sorry, my apologies for getting your former and present titles mixed up here in the beginning. All of the discussions, Vijaya, what do you think? What are your main takeaways?
Yeah, well, I want to echo what Professor said. I would like to see particularly rich countries place Africa's energy poverty and Africa's need to industrialize at the very center of the conversation, and not to use politically convenient slogans or make decisions that have zero political cost at home, but that are devastating to Africans and to solving poverty in Africa. I hope we can move to a more honest dialogue around the financing of fossil fuels, particularly gas, and also around the financing of renewables, which all countries need to do to address, the dual challenges of energy poverty and climate change.
Thank you very much, and to my colleagues here on the stage, Raul, what are your main takeaways?
Well, first of all, we've mentioned Qatar like twice, maybe 3 times, and today, just now, Ghana is playing against Uruguay, and
I see you have your phone. What's
yes.
the score?
And so, what is the link there with soccer? Just think about how many chances Africa has to play the World Cup, and think about the number of countries that Europe provides to the competition, the number of countries that the whole American continent provides to the competition, and the number of countries, much smaller number of countries that Africa can or is allowed to provide. There is almost like a parallel there in terms of like the imbalance of opportunity, right? And so, I would agree with many of the statements made here, even across the different perspectives in terms of like addressing that imbalance. For me, the key thing around that, or to start doing that, start with people, right? Just think about what other people needs. And don't even talk about clean or dirty. Don't think about, just think about people. And today, 600 million people in Africa don't have access to electricity. And so for me, that's the biggest takeaway. How to address it, there are many pathways, and every country has their own approach. But if you think about people, the approach oftentimes falls into the clean way. So that's my takeaway.
Aaron said that the production of gas is unprofitable, and that's the bottom line. How do we make the production of renewable energy in Africa profitable, not just in social terms for the people, as you've been talking about, but also in economic terms?
Well, first of all, addressing some of the financial capital market issues that have been mentioned extensively in this conversation. But if we think about people today, while 600 million people are waiting to access electricity, distributed energy resources. And even if those distributed energy resources, such as mini grids, that are for the biggest segment of the population that may not have the same purchasing power, there's still profitable ways to provide electricity to the last mile. And there are examples of that in Nigeria, for example, where the distribution network is privatized and you have companies actually making money out of actually addressing a particular need. So there isn't like an either or in business and addressing a social need. In fact, there is a clear marriage there. So distributed energy resources, they're not just profitable, they're also addressing the justice issues that we just discussed.
Speaking of that, I would like to mention one tool or a policy toolkit that we at the Development Center have been developing for the last couple of years. And you mentioned Nigeria. Nigeria is not a member of the Development Center, but we are working with them on this. It's called EFFECT, that's the acronym, and which stands for Equitable Framework and Finance for Extractive-Based Countries in Transition. A long title, but basically the purpose and the mission of this toolkit is to help extractive countries in developing countries or lead together extractive economies, both from developed and developing countries, to design policies and ways to help developing countries decarbonize without the economic and the social ramifications, which, of course, a country like Nigeria, which is dependent on oil for their revenue, you cannot just say one day, you have to stop this. This is not good. So we have to come together and work on these policies and this roadmap together in order to find a way to do this. And this is one of the purpose. And Nigeria is co-chairing this project with the European Union. And we have a lot of countries from of all income levels, like we work at the Development Center. So this was the advertising corner of this event. But Aaron, your takeaway. How do if I give you the same question as I asked Raul, how do you make renewable production in Africa profitable and sort of interesting opportunity for investors? Can we expect private investors to be more interested there than in the gas as you were discussing before?
The different countries are at different places, and there are different kind of steps along the road. I think, sometimes it's a matter early on of the governments signaling that they're committed to renewables and that they're not hostile and they're willing to entertain, invest. I mean, a lot of these energy transition plans and things that are coming out now, like that's part of what they're for, right? The audience is for foreign investors, and it's a way of saying like, no, like we're cool, like we get it, we're gonna do it, like you can bring your money and not worry too much. Some of it is, there needs to be policy changes, there need to be incentives, subsidies, new institutions created, in the countries themselves. Sometimes there need to be, education and sensitization campaigns about like, well, what is the value of renewables and who can they be for? And there also need to be new, on the investor side, new tools and new types of financial instruments, and also like a much greater willingness to take different kinds of risks and different levels of risk than what investors are taking now. I mean, if you look at the composition of this Just Energy Transition Partnership, the plan for South Africa, it is, everybody agrees there have to be more grants, there have to be cheaper loans, there have to be new types of instruments. But when you look at the details in South Africa, it's just loans. And they're a little bit cheaper than what you can get from a bank, but it can't all happen that way, especially when you have industries like mini grids or wherever. In some of these countries, they need grants for 30, 50, 60% of their capital costs. So if investors stay comfortable, it can only go so far.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our partners at the Global Center for Development, and from the OECD Development Center. I'm very grateful for this debate. I think this will not be the last conversation about this issue. We did our best, but there are still a few issues that need to be resolved, and to reach that practical middle ground that has been discussed here. And I think, and I hope that this conversation is a part of that journey, because at the end of the day, I think it's in everyone's interest, not least the people of Africa, to find that common ground. There are indeed challenges, but the other side of a challenge is opportunity. So I think we've also been discussing that. One final commercial. I just wanted to also invite all of you to participate in the plenary of the Policy Dialogue of Natural-Based Resources, which is, we will be discussing the effect there as well. It's virtual, and it's going to be held on December 15th and 16th, and you can find all the information on the Development Center's website. But here from Washington, I would like to thank everyone, and especially the panelists, and wish all of you a good day and a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.